Hello. This lecture is intended for students taking Anatomy and Physiology 1 at Madison Area Technical College with Gina Piscatelli. In this lecture, I will focus on the functions of the diencephalon, the midbrain, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The photograph that you're looking at was taken of a brain model with much of the cerebrum removed. Notice the labeled insular lobe. This is the part of the cerebrum that remains. And deep to this insular lobe lies the diencephalon, one of our major topics for today. Also labeled are the cerebral peduncles, part of the midbrain, and the pons and the medulla oblongata. The brainstem includes three structures: the cerebral peduncles, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum has also been removed from this particular model. There is a worksheet to go along with this lecture to help you narrow down the functions of these different regions, and I'm showing it on the screen here. It's called Worksheet for Lecture, Function of the Midbrain, Brainstem, and Cerebellum, and it relates to one of your study guide questions. So to begin, recall the anatomical regions of the brain. It's subdivided into different regions based on how it develops in an embryo from the embryonic neural tube, which is shown on the left. Superiorly is the forebrain, shown in yellow, followed by the diencephalon. I'm sorry, that is part of the forebrain. It's followed by the midbrain, shown in red, and then inferiorly the hindbrain. As cells divide and they differentiate, certain swellings or outpocketings develop into specific structures that you're familiar with in an adult brain. The forebrain develops into the cerebrum and the diencephalon, which is shown in yellow and blue. The midbrain will develop into specific structures that aren't labeled on this diagram, but they're called the Corpora Quadrigemina and the cerebral peduncles. The hindbrain develops into the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. Note that when people refer to the brainstem, they're actually referring to the two hindbrain structures I mentioned, the pons and the medulla, and one midbrain structure, the cerebral peduncles. We'll come back to that concept. So we have already learned about the cerebrum. This particular lecture will cover the other forebrain regions known as the diencephalon collectively. These regions include the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. Two midbrain structures that you'll learn in lab if you haven't already are the Corpora Quadrigemina and the cerebral peduncles that I mentioned previously. We will also look at three structures in the hindbrain: the cerebellum, the medulla, and the pons. So the cerebellum is here, the medulla oblongata is here, and the pons is there. So let's start with the diencephalon. The three regions again of the diencephalon are called the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland, and they're labeled on this sagittal section of the brain. We're going to start with the thalamus, and it is difficult to get a three-dimensional understanding of the two lobes of the thalamus. But what you can see on this sagittal section is its intermediate mass that connects the two lobes of the thalamus. So what is circled on the diagram is tissue of the right lobe of the thalamus, so the medial face of the right lobe. What the black line points to is the intermediate mass. Notice that the hypothalamus, shaded in red, is named hypo because it lies inferior to the thalamus. The pineal gland is circled in green, and its function is to synthesize and secrete melatonin, which you've probably heard of, and is important for our circadian rhythms and our sleep-wake cycle. Here we can see the two lobes of the thalamus. They're shown in purple. On the left is an anterior view, and on the right is a posterior view. So what's also visible on that posterior view is the pineal gland, kind of located in the midline between the two lobes of the thalamus. The space between the two lobes of the thalamus is where the third ventricle lies. And note that they are connected, and that would be right here and here where they're connected. That would be the intermediate mass that you see on most sagittal sections. So the function of the thalamus is to organize sensory information and relay it to the cerebral cortex. Here in the thalamus is where sensory information is integrated and filtered, as well as organized before it's channeled to the appropriate primary sensory region of the brain. The function, of course, of the pineal gland we've mentioned, which is to secrete melatonin. As a gateway of sensory information, the thalamus contains a lot of gray matter with very specific nuclei or groups of neuron cell bodies. Each nucleus or group of neurons will carry a specific type of sensory information to the cerebral cortex. Shown on this picture or diagram is an example of how sensory information is organized in the thalamus. For example, the nuclei involving auditory information is labeled and shown in green. The nuclei involved in visual information, also shown in green, is labeled. And somatic sensory information is shown, the nucleus for that is shown here in blue. So sensory information is going to come from different regions of the body to the thalamus on its way to the cerebrum. And that looks like a kindergartner's handwriting. Sorry. The final part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus shows, or this diagram shows the hypothalamus's relationship to the thalamus and to the pituitary gland. So the thalamus is shown in light purple, and the hypothalamus is a very small region, at least on this view, and it's shown in dark purple. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland by a stalk of tissue called the infundibulum. So the pituitary gland itself could be considered part of the brain or part of the endocrine system because it does contain some neural tissue, but it also contains epithelial tissue that secretes hormones. In both cases, both types of tissues, these cells are secreting hormones, and they're called, even the neural tissue, and they're called hormones because they're going to travel through the bloodstream to reach different organs in the body. The functions of the hypothalamus are diverse. and includes certain centers that control the pituitary gland and other centers related to the autonomic nervous system. For example, the hypothalamus makes some hormones that control what hormones or when the pituitary gland secretes these hormones. It is also important for water balance. And there's a nucleus in the hypothalamus that actually contains osmoreceptors and stimulates thirst. In another case, there's a nucleus of neurons that secrete a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, and that increases water resorption by the kidney. So a primary function of the hypothalamus is indeed water balance. Other nuclei in the hypothalamus regulate body temperature, shown in orange here, appetite and hunger, shown in two different shades of green. And still another location produces the hormone oxytocin, which is important in uterine contractions during childbirth. This list of functions is not complete, but it does include some of the functions that we will visit later in the course. So now that we've covered the diencephalon, the thalamus, which is the sensory gateway to the cerebrum, the hypothalamus, which is the major control center for the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system, and the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin, we're going to move on to the midbrain. So the midbrain includes two predominant structures, the corpora quadrigemina and the cerebral peduncles. The corpora quadrigemina are dorsal, and they're most easily visible by separating the cerebellum from the cerebrum by widening that transverse fissure. The corpora quadrigemina, shown right here, these two bumps, because we're only seeing two, there's actually four, includes two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi. The cerebral peduncles are most easily seen in sagittal or frontal views because they are anterior or ventral. So we're going to look at some other views of these. Let's start with the corpora quadrigemina. So rather than looking at a whole brain, now we've got a sagittal section on the left, and then we just kind of have the cerebrum removed on this picture on the right. So the corpora quadrigemina on the left are shaded in red, and over on the right picture, all four are shown, hence quad in the name, are shown because the brain is kind of slanted. We're not seeing a completely lateral view. So the two on the top, the two bumps on the top, are called the superior colliculi, and they receive visual information and are important during blinking and tracking reflexes. The inferior colliculi are the lower two bumps. They receive auditory information and help in tracking again, but by localizing a sound. And then we turn our head towards wherever the sound is coming from. So now we'll look ventrally. So I'm going to orient you on this sagittal section. Here's the thalamus. Here's the hypothalamus. These little tiny bumps over here, those are the corpora quadrigemina we just looked at. And now we're looking more ventrally at the cerebral peduncles that I just circled. On the picture on the right, you can see the cerebral peduncles in green, because this is a ventral view, and I've just sort of outlined them here. The major function of the cerebral peduncles relate to the fact that they contain white matter projection tracts that carry information from the cerebrum to the spinal cord, so they are carrying motor information. For this reason, they're part of what is called the corticospinal tract. So the corticospinal tract means from the cortex to the spinal cord. And so if you imagine the cerebrum is up here, well, and it is right here, information's going to have to get to the spinal cord. To do that, it has to go through the cerebral peduncles. Another part of the midbrain that we don't necessarily have to focus on is just slightly superior to the corpora quadrigemina. And it's this region that's shaded brown called the Substantia Nigra. And I talked about it when I talked about the cerebral basal ganglia and the gray matter in the cerebrum. So the Substantia Nigra, as I mentioned before, isn't technically part of the cerebrum. It's part of the midbrain. Regardless, it's the location or the nuclei that degenerate in Parkinson's disease. So motor information on its way from the cerebrum through the cerebral peduncles can also, these are the cerebral peduncles right here, can also be influenced by neurons coming from the Substantia Nigra. So it's like fine-tuning movements. And without the Substantia Nigra functioning, patients experience resting tremors, inability to have erect posture, so they're kind of stooped over. They have a slow shuffling gait, and what's also noticeable is it's hard for them to initiate movements. Okay, now we'll go on to the three regions of the brainstem. These three regions include the cerebral peduncles, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. That's usually what people mean when they talk about the brainstem. So we've already talked about the cerebral peduncles, so let's focus on the pons. The function of the pons is pretty diverse. So one of its major functions is involved with respiration. It modulates how deep we breathe and our rhythm by providing input to the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata initiates a breath, but the pons can give input to hasten or delay the transition between inspiring and expiring, therefore sort of modifying our rhythm and how deeply we breathe. The other thing that the pons does that's quite interesting is again involved with transitions, but this is during transitions that occur during sleep. So you may have heard of REM sleep stages and non-REM sleep stages. So REM refers to rapid eye movement, and you cycle between REM and non-REM sleep at certain frequencies throughout the night. A transition has to happen for that to occur, and the pons is involved with that, most likely because it's related to the breathing pattern, because our breathing changes in our different sleep stages. In addition, the pons has many projection tracts. It's a lot of white matter and commissural tracts. So the projection tracts are between the cerebellum up to the cerebrum and back down. The commissural tracts are from left to right cerebellum. So there's a lot of white matter in the pons. The medulla oblongata has three very important motor centers. This is one of its primary functions, and that is, well, three primary functions. And that is it has a cardiac center, it has a respiratory center, and it has a vasomotor center, which relates to your blood vessels constricting or dilating. The medulla oblongata has tracts of white matter that are both afferent and efferent, which means running in both directions, superiorly and inferiorly. In addition, the medulla oblongata controls many of our autonomic functions, things that we can't control. For example, you can try to hold your breath, but eventually your body will take over and you'll start breathing. That's due to the medulla oblongata. Sometimes coughing is also spontaneous. That's the medulla. Sneezing, medulla. Sweating is less about regulating body temperature and more about sending a signal to the sweat glands. But of course, the hypothalamus would be involved as well. The medulla oblongata is also involved with gagging and swallowing. It's amazing everything that it does. So the cardiac center, these are the real three that you'll touch on in A and P2. The cardiac center, the vasomotor center, and the respiratory center. The cardiac center is where the heart rate and the force of the heartbeat is regulated. Now the heart can beat without input from medulla oblongata, but not for very long. The respiratory center is where breath or breathing is initiated, and the vasomotor center regulates our blood pressure by controlling how constricted or dilated our blood vessels are. The medulla oblongata, because it has so many functions, is associated with many cranial nerves, anatomically as well as functionally. So we aren't going to learn the anatomy of all 12 pairs of cranial nerves, but we will learn the functions of them. Notice that they're shown in yellow, and most of them are located here near the brainstem. So, the 12th cranial nerve, the last one, is called the hypoglossal nerve. Glossal refers to the tongue. And the accessory nerve is the 11th one. That actually controls a muscle in your shoulder, which is interesting, huh? Very varied in this location. The vagus nerve is a major autonomic nerve. That's the one that runs to your heart and to many other internal organs. The glossopharyngeal nerve, number 9, is also located close to the medulla oblongata, and that's going to be involved with swallowing and some taste. The facial nerve, which has to do with muscles of facial expression, comes off just between the pons and the medulla oblongata. So that's just to name a few. And to point out that the medulla oblongata is surrounded by many, I don't know if surrounded is the right word, but associated with many cranial nerves. The ventral surface of the medulla oblongata appears to be two kind of elongated bumps. These are called the pyramids. I'll erase that so you can actually see them. And this part of the medulla oblongata and the pyramids contain tracts of white matter called the corticospinal tracts. So when the cerebral cortex sends motor information down, it goes through the cerebral peduncles, and then through the medulla oblongata on the way to the spinal cord. I just anatomically wanted to point these pyramids out because when we talk about spinal nerves, we'll discuss these pyramids again. Okay, the last region of the brain that we'll look at the function for is the cerebellum. The cerebellum, considered part of the hindbrain, is a little bit like the cerebrum in the sense that there is both white matter and gray matter. So the white matter is deep and the gray matter is superficial, just like the cerebral cortex. Notice that the cerebral or cerebellar cortex is highly convoluted and it forms these folia. The pons is located here ventrally. The fourth ventricle is right here. It has a choroid plexus, which you can barely see, and then the medulla oblongata is here. This region is the cerebral peduncles. So the major function of the cerebellum relates to motor coordination. It receives input from many areas of the brain, as well as peripheral sensory information, and it can relay that sensory information to the motor association areas. So the cerebellum is best known in aiding motor coordination and playing a role in balance so that we can perform precise coordinated movements of our skeletal muscles. But it's also known to be involved with muscle tone and the ability to sense where your body is in space. We call that proprioception. And it's even been associated with things like accurately perceiving time passing, as well as other cognitive functions. So I think the cerebellum is a hot area of research right now. So those are all of the functional anatomical locations in the brain that we're going to learn. And the next lecture will cover cranial nerves. Thank you.